My name is Matt Huffman. I'm the lead organizer, executive director of the B.U.I.L.D organization. And I wanted to begin by telling you a little bit about myself because I very much bring myself into this work with B.U.I.L.D, and who I am is very much shaped by the events that make up my life. And so I am originally from Pikeville, Kentucky, which if you've noticed by now, I have a little bit of an accent. That's where that's from. I was raised in a church. I won't give too much details because it's a small town, but it was a very fundamentalist, legalistic church. And I was born and raised there, was there every Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday evening, anytime the doors were open. And that was just the world that I lived in. And to kind of give a short story of what that was like theologically, spiritually, was when I was in high school, I dated a Catholic girl, and my grandmother gave me a talking to because I was dating a Catholic girl. And so that was how closed off it was. But that was, my world. I didn't know anything different. And I went to college in New York City to a small Christian college called the King's College. And remarkably, I received a great education, but it was very much in line with some of the beliefs that I was given as a kid. Kind of like the ultimate goal of faith is to get people to think like you, look like you, act like you. And so I became really disillusioned because the movement that my spirit was drawing me towards wasn't matching up to the dogmas that I was given. And so I ended up stepping away for some time. And actually during that time, I still felt this longing in my spirit, but I didn't know how to feed it. And so I went looking, and during this time I read some Hindu, some Buddhist, some Sufi, some Kabbalah, just very little bits of different faiths, trying to feed my spirit, because my spirit was still longing. And it was through kind of reading all those that I was drawn back towards my own tradition, just a very different instantiation of it, one that aligned with what my spirit had been saying that whole time. So that's a very brief story of my life. I've been with B.U.I.L.D since 2018. I started out as an associate organizer, and one of the things that drew me into this work was what had been missing from the faith that I was given. When I was 7 years old, my dad went to prison, and so my mom had to raise 3 boys by herself, and the church didn't have anything to say about the struggles that my mom went through to make sure that we had a place to live, that we could make it to doctor's appointments, that we had food to eat. The church was very otherworldly. But when I read the scriptures that I was told to read, there was a lot about the poor, the widow, the orphan, justice. And so when I came back to my tradition, I wanted to hold on to that value that my spirit was pulling me towards all throughout that time. And so that drew me to a year of AmeriCorps Vista service here in Lexington. And during that time, I worked for a nonprofit that helped ex-offenders start their own businesses, since they struggle to find work because they have a record. And so the thought is, if they can start their own businesses, they can bypass that. But one of the things that I kind of noticed was, no matter how many people we helped start their own business, the problem was still there. People were still coming out of prison with records and couldn't get jobs. And so I wanted to have an effect on the systems that were creating these things. And so that's what drew me to build these more systemic structural changes. But I have been in my current role as the executive director or lead organizer for almost a year now. And just to give you a little bit of more background on my spirit and my mind, I'm currently wrapping up a 2-year program at the Living School at the Center for Action and Contemplation. And I am in the beginning of just finished my second semester of seminary at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, where I'm getting a Master of Divinity in Social Transformation. So hopefully just that few minutes, you can get a little bit of an idea of who I am and where I'm coming from. But I also look forward to dialoguing more and getting to know some of you folks more. So now on to B.U.I.L.D. I'll start with some history of the organization. So in 2001, several local clergy came together to discuss how they could create systemic change in Lexington. And as a result of those discussions, B.U.I.L.D. was formed. B.U.I.L.D. is a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that was incorporated in July of 2002. And then in June 2003, a covenant was signed by 11 congregations, officers were elected, bylaws were adopted, and B.U.I.L.D. leaders chose the first community problems they would focus on. And since that time, B.U.I.L.D.'s membership has grown to currently 27 congregations. B.U.I.L.D.'s membership is open to all Fayette County congregations, places of faith, also community organizations, and other institutional structures with limitations set in the bylaws. But currently, we're just congregations. And as B.U.I.L.D. developed, it began to highlight the injustices that were sanctioned by our city, as well as to organize and build local power to intervene. We saw that people were hungry to galvanize their own communities, and our success has empowered members to lead campaigns to better their own lives and neighborhoods. And since 2003, B.U.I.L.D. has significantly impacted a number of community problems, which I'll touch on a little bit later in this presentation. But I want to kind of start with what we call our justice ministry vision, because I think this paints a good picture of who we are, why we are, and how we do it. So there are a number of places in scriptures we could look at, and in other faith scriptures that would have a similar message. But one that we constantly lift up, that I'm sure many of us are familiar with, is Micah 6:8, which says, "And what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God?" And so when we talk about our justice ministry vision, we ask, how are we doing at these three requirements that we find in the Hebrew scriptures: the justice, the mercy, and the faithfulness? And so if we break those down, we can look at faithfulness as anything that encourages us in our faith, encourages our walk with the divine. So these will be weekly services, prayer meetings, retreats, Bible studies, choir, praise team, and there's lots and lots of more examples. Anything that encourages that humble, faithful walk with God. And so usually the congregations that I get to work with, they're doing a good job at the faithfulness piece. That's usually the bread and butter. Then the second requirement we lifted up, mercy. So these are meeting individuals' direct needs. We think of these as acts of kindness and charity. So food pantries, clothes closets or clothing drives, giving out direct money, tutoring programs. We could go on and on with those as well. And our faith community does a really good job of this mercy requirement as well. Then if we move on to justice, if we look at least at the Hebrew scriptures, you'll see this thread of justice as holding Pharaoh accountable, holding kings accountable, holding the nobles accountable for the fair treatment of everyone, especially the poor, the widow, and the orphan. And justice we don't do well at, but not because we don't want to, or we don't desire to, or we don't hope to, but because justice is not something that we can do on our own. So we need power to deal with powerful systems. And I think we all know or intuit that in our society, power comes from two sources: organized money or organized people. And I think people are really aware of this on a national level, um, but I'm not sure we thoroughly grasp it here, even locally. And honestly, when I first moved to Lexington, I would have not assumed it. But the longer I've lived here and just reading the news, you can see hints of it. And so, like, one example that comes to mind was back in either 2018 or 2019. There was a story about someone at a development firm, CRM development, I believe, being involved in illegal campaign contributions to city council members, and I believe the mayor at the time as well. Um, and so that there wasn't a whole lot of coverage to it. There were a few articles, but you can imagine that if you have one case of a development company illegally offering campaign contributions in hopes of getting a city contract, you can imagine that that happens more than just that one time. And so this idea that organized money holds power even here locally is something that I think, if we give it the thought it deserves, the organized money has the power to shape our community more than we like. And so, power coming from two sources: organized money, organized people. Us, through our congregations, our power comes from organized people. But one congregation doesn't have enough people power to hold big institutions accountable for justice. Even our larger congregations by themselves don't have that power. And so we look to the book of Nehemiah for how we can build and use that power, because it's not just numbers of people, it's organized people. And so I'm going to briefly go through Nehemiah chapter 5 to set up how we organize our people power to do justice. So very briefly, Nehemiah is cupbearer to the king of Persia, and he goes back to his homeland, where they are trying to restore their identity by rebuilding a wall around the city. And while there, the people raise a cry of injustice to Nehemiah, because over the past few years, there was a drought, crops failed, and people are then forced to borrow money to buy food and to pay taxes. And then the drought continues, and these people can't repay those loans. And so the money lenders then take advantage of their inability to pay back their loans. And it says that they took everything: their fields, their vineyards, their orchards. Nehemiah says they even forced people to sell their children into slavery. And so that's why the people are crying out to Nehemiah. And in Hebrew scriptures, it says Nehemiah was angry when he heard their cries. And so he could have called for acts of mercy to give people food, to offer people credit, or to give people clothing. But it says he doesn't do that. He calls a great assembly. And in front of this great assembly, he brings these money lenders and he demands that they give everything back. And in the book of Nehemiah, it says they did. And so we look at that great assembly that Nehemiah called, the way he was able to get people back the things that have been taken from them. And we want to model our people power after that. And so every year we hold a Nehemiah action in which we are working up to throughout the year, so that we can hold a great assembly, so that we can have public officials where we call them to make public commitments that are going to benefit the city as a whole. And so the vision, very simply, we say 52-1. So the idea is that we turn out our average worship attendance. So if 200 people on average come out every week, the idea is if we can get 200 people out every week for faithfulness, surely we can get 200 people out once a year for justice for the Nehemiah action. And so one of the things that I really like to encourage people to think about is, imagine if, as people of faith, all of us turn out our average worship attendance together to call for public commitments that will transform Lexington for the betterment of every single human being that lives here. You can imagine the things that would change and that would be different. And not to get too in the weeds, but the way that a Nehemiah action happens takes work, and it takes intentionality, it takes relationships. Even the best pastor that is a member congregation can tell you that just preaching people out to the Nehemiah action does not work. We have to be intentional. And so we have a tool called Justice Ministry Networks. And so a justice ministry network is simply, at each congregation, they have a justice ministry, just like they might have a building fund ministry or a choir ministry. They set up a justice ministry that's then set up through formal networks of relationships within the congregation. And so the justice ministry builds that justice ministry at that congregation to join the justice ministries of other congregations at the Nehemiah action. And again, try not to get too into the weeds here, but so a justice ministry network member brings 3 people to the Nehemiah action, and they attend 3 other organization-wide meetings throughout the year. And I'll talk a little bit more about those momentarily. And then they're also invited to invest because we want to be owned by our members so that we can work on the problems that affect our members and the solutions that our members have found. We don't want to be owned by outside entities that could then dictate what we work on. And so as we build and exercise our justice ministry network at each of our congregations, we increase the congregation's capacity to powerfully respond to that requirement to do justice. And this will move Lexington forward to becoming more and more a city of God where justice rolls down like water. And so that is the vision. Hopefully that didn't get too in the weeds for folks. But next I'm going to talk about how the organization actually works. And I'll do that by describing the process while also using a specific issue, because I think that kind of helps put some flesh on it. So the first part of our process is called our listening process. So as the name implies, the first thing we do is we listen to our people, the people in the community. So for example, in the fall of 2019, over 500 people attended house meetings to discuss the community problems that keep them up at night, their deepest fears, worries, anxieties. And so in these house meetings, we heard stories about friends and families who were cycling in and out of mental health crisis situations. And we saw that through these stories that often a lack of stable housing was a key contributor for these cycling in and out of crisis situations. And then in October, over 400 B.U.I.L.D leaders gathered at our what we call our Community Problems Assembly and voted to address this specific problem. So the community told stories about the problems that were keeping them up at night, and then they came together to vote on the new issue that they wanted to work on. The next step is we research the problem and we look for winnable solutions. So after that, the folks chose to address mental health, specifically people cycling in and out as a result of not having a safe, decent place to live. We conducted dozens of research meetings with professionals, city and civic leaders. And in every meeting, we heard that the lack of affordable housing was one of the biggest barriers to people's recovery from a mental health crisis situation. People were being discharged from Eastern State directly back to a homeless shelter because there was no other housing available to them. And so you may or may not know, B.U.I.L.D has worked to address the affordable housing crisis Lexington in the past. After a 6-year campaign, we won the creation of the Affordable Housing Fund in 2014 with $2 million in annual funding. And so far, just from that, nearly 3,000 families are housed because of our efforts. Now, that was a huge victory for Lexington, but last year, during the time, or now 2 years ago, during the time when we were being ordered to stay healthy at home, the Mayor Gordon cut in her proposed budget 90% of the funding from the Affordable Housing Fund in her proposed budget. And so we organized to say no. We had over 150 cars come to a socially distant drive-in rally for affordable housing to pressure our council members to fix the budget and restore full funding for affordable housing, and we won. And we've also seen through the pandemic that the $2 million per year in the Affordable Housing Fund doesn't go nearly far enough. So currently, more than 14,000 families in Lexington face impossible decisions every month between paying rent and buying groceries, or paying rent and paying for their medication. And additionally, Lexington is still losing over 400 units of affordable rental housing each year. So the 2 million doesn't go nearly far enough. Okay, next step is we take action. So the third step after listening and researching is arguably the most important. So last year on April 27th, we organized our Nehemiah Action Assembly. It looked a little bit different as a result of the pandemic, but we still gathered with a hybrid car rally with over 200 cars at Mary Queen of the Holy Rosary and another 900 households represented on Zoom for a total of over 1,700 people. And so as I talked earlier, our power is in our numbers that we build through these Justice Ministry Network. And so together we challenge County Council Member James Brown to take bold action to address the critical need for affordable housing in our city. And we want a commitment for him to propose that the council allocate $10 million of the American Rescue Plan funds to the Affordable Housing Fund this year, and to work with B.U.I.L.D to identify a dedicated revenue stream that could generate $10 million per year. This will ensure that the fund is secure despite whoever might be in office. And then the last part of the action step is we follow up. So we were there at the council meeting in 2014 to make sure that Mayor Gray brought the plan for the Affordable Housing Fund with $2 million of ongoing funding before the council, and it was passed unanimously. In 2020, we were there to make sure that the council fully restored the $2 million in funding that was cut from the budget. And then last year, we followed up with Councilmember Brown to make sure that he followed through on his commitment, and council unanimously approved the $10 million. And Lexington has since doubled its number of affordable housing units. As I mentioned before, nearly 3,000 families now have safe, decent, affordable housing. And so this is just one example to kind of show you how the process works. And so I wanted to touch on what we're currently working on, especially since the Nehemiah Action is next week. So through that same process of listening, voting, research, we are currently still focused on affordable housing. As I just mentioned, we want ongoing dedicated funding. So if there's a dedicated revenue stream, then it's not up to a budget decision every year. It can't be cut. If for other programs, it would be a stream that generates its own money. And so we are working to get 10 million in dedicated funding, because we saw that when we got the 10 million added last year, we doubled the amount of affordable housing units. And we want to continue that, given that there's 14,000 families that are paying half or more of their income on rent. And so at our Nehemiah Action this year, Councilmember James Brown, Councilmember Ellinger, and Councilmember Kloiber will all come to the stage, and we will ask them to identify and fight for a $10 million a year dedicated funding stream. So that's one of our current issues. Another current issue is violence. And so similar to the Affordable Housing Fund, it was a 6-year campaign before we won. We've been working on violence since 2014, 2015. And as we all know, since then, homicides have continued to rise. Through our research process, we found a evidence-based violence reduction strategy that's working in dozens of cities across the country. And so we've been pushing for this evidence-based violence reduction strategy. And we are continuing to push for that. As of right now, Mayor Gordon will not be at the Nehemiah Action. And so unless she changes her mind, we are inviting all mayoral candidates, and we are going to, we're a 501c3, and so we will never endorse any political candidates, but we are going to invite them on stage, give some background on the violence issue, and allow them to each respond. Again, unless the mayor does come, then we will call on her to make a public commitment. And then the last current issue is mental health. And through our research process this time, one of the things we identified from the House meetings and through the research process, that our neighbors with serious mental illness that do not have reliable transportation cannot make it to doctor's appointments or to the pharmacy. And so we are going to be making an ask, which, though it being chaotic Nehemiah Action season, that ask will be finalized on Tuesday. But it will be either we'll be asking New Vista or we'll be asking Lexington about some form of reliable transportation for our neighbors with serious mental illness. So the three current issues: affordable housing, violence, and mental health. Then I wanted to take the opportunity just to lift up some past issue victories. This doesn't cover all of them, but it's always helpful for folks to know other things that we have won in the past. And so, as I've already lifted up, we won the $2 million a year Affordable Housing Fund. We won $10 million from ARPA last year, and we're continuing that work. Also, currently 14,000 people a year are getting primary health care because B.U.I.L.D pressed local providers to increase access in 2007. And this is an $8 million a year victory. Currently, there are over 1,500 visits a month to the needle exchange program through the health department because B.U.I.L.D pressed our health commissioner to expand hours and services. And so in February 2022 alone, just 1 month, more than 57,000 dirty needles were collected through the needle exchange program. Additionally, over 450 people have been referred to treatment through the program. B.U.I.L.D got the city to continue funding mental health court as a diversion program to provide treatment instead of jail for people with severe mental illness who commit minor crimes. And this has saved taxpayers at least $1.5 million in the last 2 years. We last year won a pilot program of restorative practices in 5 schools in Fayette County Public Schools because we heard in House meeting stories that children of color were being punished more often and more harshly. And then we heard from teachers that they weren't given the resources they need to handle discipline. And so we identified an evidence-based restorative practices program that's working in schools all across the country. And we won that last year. B.U.I.L.D discovered in 2006 that there was no drug treatment program for women in the Fayette County Jail while the program for men was reducing the recidivism rate from 60% to 19%. So it was there was drug treatment in the jail for men, but not for women. So B.U.I.L.D got then Mayor Teresa Isaac to put $175,000 in the budget each year for a women's drug treatment program in the jail. And then the last one I'll mention is B.U.I.L.D got Lexington to start an employment bus, which takes citizens to work during the hours that the regular bus is not in service. And this began in August 2006. So those are just some of the past issue victories that we have won. And so in conclusion, I want to say that our Nehemiah action is next week. I would absolutely love if every one of you would join us. It's Tuesday, May 3rd at 7 p.m. at Central Bank Center. Very newly renovated and newly opened. The doors are right across the street from Gate 2. We will have the chairs, the rows spaced out to offer some distancing for folks. And so we would love if anyone and everyone came and bring folks with you. It's a good opportunity to see the process live and in action. And then I also wanted to say in conclusion that we talked about B.U.I.L.D stands for Building a United Interfaith Lexington through Direct Action. And we are currently not living up to our name. So as diverse as we currently are, is we have a Unitarian Universalist church and a Lexington Friends meeting Quakers. That's as diverse as we get. Now, I will say that we are a diverse group of congregations, but we are not living up to that interfaith name. And so on one hand, I think that we are robbed of the richness that can only come from diverse voices. Like I lifted up that I was raised kind of fundamentalist, but a fundamentalist in the Christian tradition. And one of the things that I remember is, there's 4 gospels in the New Testament. And there was this urgency to making all the 4 gospels line up. Like they have to agree, they can't contradict each other. Even though one gospel has Jesus dying on one day and another gospel has Jesus dying on a different day, among other things. And they all kind of have even different perspectives on Jesus. But so growing up, there was that need that we have to make this match up. Whereas later in my life, I now see how beautiful and rich it is that the church canonized 4 different perspectives on an encounter with the divine. It's almost like the tradition was saying, you don't have to get like facts right. That's not what we're talking about. We are talking about the perspective that comes from encountering the divine. And so that's baked within the Christian tradition. And so without diverse voices, we are missing those perspectives. And so we are robbed of the richness that can only come from having those diverse voices. And then on the other hand, B.U.I.L.D is an opportunity to live out a part of our faith that congregations, mosques, synagogues, and others can't do on their own, because you have to build that people power. It's an opportunity to shape our city to one that honors the human dignity that is central to all of our faiths. And so if I was back in my early days, this is the point where I would have an altar call. So we would have the organ playing, maybe something contemplative, and I would ask, will everybody bow their head and close their eyes? And I would say something really convicting about, about how COVID has revealed the deep and growing gaps that were already there before COVID, but COVID has just magnified them and made it so we can't ignore them anymore. And how B.U.I.L.D is an opportunity to shape Lexington as it comes out of the pandemic, because there's this urge, oh, we just want to go back to normal, but we can't forget that normal was terrible for a lot of our neighbors. And so this is an opportunity to refuse to go back to normal, but to create a new normal that's more inclusive, that honors the dignity of all human beings. And so then if we were doing the altar call and every head bowed, eye closed, I would say, if you want to do that, raise your hand. But I'm not going to do that, but that's what I will be doing. But I appreciate, again, this opportunity to share with you. Hopefully something made sense. After I get talking for too long, I worry that my words jumble, and but I just appreciate this opportunity and look forward to any questions, comments, dialogue that we may have. So I'm gonna.
As for these new congregations, which includes my own Christ Church Cathedral, what obligations does that congregation have once they commit to B.U.I.L.D? And secondly, are there does B.U.I.L.D exist in other cities, and how does that appear there?
Yeah. So when a congregation joins, the obligations, one is all of our member congregations pay dues. And so that one kind of commitment that each congregation makes, it's kind of dues to join this opportunity to build power. And then the other commitment is just to building a justice ministry there locally. So those are kind of the two main things: is building a justice ministry at the congregation and paying dues. And then for other organizations, we have what we call sister organizations. I was all across the country. Basically, out west, there are a few organizations in Kansas, and that's as far west currently, but we have sister organizations in Columbus, Ohio, Louisville, Evansville, Indiana, Charleston, South Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina. I won't name all of them, but they all have different names. Like our organization in Louisville is called CLOUT, which stands for Citizens of Louisville Organized and United Together. But we're combined under this banner of DART, which is the Direct Action and Research Training Center. And so they're small staff, but connects us together with these organizations in other cities.
Yeah, Matt, great presentation. I think a lot of the violence is drug related. And I'm wondering, this evidence-based mitigation for the drug violence. I'm wondering if there are a few more details on that, and if 57,000 needles are exchanged, I think we know something about who's involved in the drug trading. Huh?
Yeah. Well, to one part of that is any of the work that we do, it's all going to be related. So also, like, affordable housing is related to violence. If people have safe, decent, affordable housing, they're less likely to get involved in violence. Similar to the work we did with education, kids that have a good education have better outcomes, less likely. And so the group violence intervention strategy is the one we identified through the research and met with, and they actually, Mayor Gray contracted with them to come in 2019, which by the time they came, Mayor Gorton was in office, but they met with police commissioner, police chief, uniformed officers, detectives, and went through each violent crime over the past 5 years, one by one. There were PowerPoint presentations, and each slide was a different crime. And so they went slide by slide by slide and discussed those crimes, and then based on that, made recommendations. And they recommended the group violence intervention strategy. And so there you can find lots of information at their website, the National Network for Safe Communities, and they can do a lot better in-depth explanation of the ins and outs. But basically, the program, it has a law enforcement component, but it lifts up the need for community programs and community leaders and social services organizations, because maybe someone is involved in violence because they can't get out from under a debt, or because they're worried that if they leave this group they're involved in, that they'll be harmed. And so maybe they need a safe house, or maybe they just need a couple $100 to get out from under this debt, what have you. So it's a kind of holistic approach to kind of meeting the needs that might have caused the person to be caught in this cycle of violence. And so I would imagine people that were involved in violence because of drugs, that would be a component to it as well.
Would you consider B.U.I.L.D. to be a political action committee? As in other words, the funding that is being requested doesn't go to B.U.I.L.D. as it goes to that organization that's already in place for that program. It's what we're trying to do is influence the funding of existing programs. Is that a correct understanding?
Correct. So we pushed in for several years, but in 2014, the city created its own affordable housing fund. So that's the city staffs it, the city controls it, the city funds it. We just won the creation of it. We just saw that there were cities across the country that had affordable housing funds. We wanted our city to do that. And so the 10 million that we won was for the city to fund its own affordable housing fund, 10 million from the American Rescue Plan money, on top of its normal 2 million. So yeah, we don't get any of that money. It's just pushing the city to allocate those funds in that particular way. We don't get any money from the city or anything like that. We, again, I mentioned earlier, we try to be, we receive money from our congregations, from members of our congregations, and then we do a corporate drive where we engage corporate partners, but we have a maximum that we'll accept from them, because again, we don't want someone to be able to dictate the work we work on. So we want to be owned by our own people.
Let me clarify a little bit in the sense that the money that the congregations and stuff give to B.U.I.L.D. are mainly to help pay for the B.U.I.L.D. organizers' salaries and like renting the Rupp Arena to have the assembly. The money that were considered for affordable housing and other things are B.U.I.L.D. only gets entities to do their jobs. So this city needed to do their job on getting more affordable housing to the people. And so that's where we just asked them to do their jobs. And so it's a different, it's not a political organization. It's not it's literally a justice work, trying to find the root cause and then finding the city official that could do the work. And it's their job to do that work. And all we're doing is bringing them to the Nehemiah Assembly and asking them to do their job. B.U.I.L.D., because of its national affiliation with all the other groups that are also within DART, gets a lot of their ideas and help on what's happened in other cities across the country. And so, yes, we do local research, we do local stuff, but we also go, what has other cities in the US been able to do for this subject matter? And that helps, it gives us an edge, is probably an easy way to look at it. The other thing that I would like to bring up that really Matt cannot fully attest to because he hasn't been here as long as I have within B.U.I.L.D. I've been with B.U.I.L.D. for at least since 2003. And I was one of the first 11 congregations to help sign up. And it really brought to my attention throughout the time in B.U.I.L.D. of how little my white female Christian brain had any idea what was really going on in Lexington. And talking to other members of other congregations and other places that they live in Lexington has helped me open my eyes to a tremendous amount of justice need in Lexington. But even more so in the background of B.U.I.L.D., we've definitely had Muslims and Jews and Christians and even other religions attend our Nehemiah assemblies. They have never fully become a member as a group, but we definitely have had some, because I've even brought some myself to the Nehemiah assemblies. So I know that in the early years, it has definitely been diverse, even through religion, within the B.U.I.L.D. assemblies. And so it's more a matter of the hesitation of, do I really want to join as a group based on the unique, what feels like overwhelming rules, but are really actually just to keep the organization alive. You have to pay the lead organizers. You can't have this organization without the lead organizers, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the B.U.I.L.D. in itself is actually utilizing its funding very well, and also doing, for 2 hours for a Nehemiah Action Assembly, when I go per year, I could be helping 5,000 people in Lexington in those 2 hours. I cannot do mercy work that fast. I absolutely cannot do it. So I've really enjoyed being able to get the root cause of helping 5,000 people in 2 hours, one night a year. It's something that is more gratifying than I could possibly ever explain. I consider it priceless.
Thank you, Ann. And I'll also lift up, because Ann has brought up the organizer salary. So our job as organizers, most of our time, at least 80% of our time, is spent helping clergy or congregational leaders build the justice ministry at their congregation. So 80% of our time is training congregations on how to build their power. We do most through one-on-one training, because when you're trying to build a justice ministry network, you're going to have obstacles, and you'll have about as many obstacles as you have human beings, because we're all related, but we're all also unique. And so there will be different obstacles that come up when you're trying to build your justice ministry. And so as organizers, we are training people one-on-one on how to build those. And then we're also training people on how to negotiate at the Nehemiah Actions, how to negotiate at the corporate appointments that we set up. And then we also do regional trainings that are group trainings. And then we also pay for our leaders and our clergy to go to national trainings that we get to go to as a part of being DART. And so the organizer salary is paying for training of congregations to build the justice ministry, build the power at their congregation. But then I also saw Carolyn in the chat. asked how much are you willing to discuss and negotiate with the city entity exactly how a program is formatted. And so I think definitely as much as is reasonable. I think so. Like the 6 years pushing for the affordable housing fund, we would say the city needs an affordable housing fund, and they would say, oh, we need to do a study. And then we'd say we would wait to do their study, and then we'd push, and they'd say, oh, we need to do a study. And so at some point, it's not really reasonable to keep doing studies. And so we're not going to negotiate like, oh, we should do a forced study. No, we should do an affordable housing fund. And so similarly, like currently we're pushing for group violence intervention strategy, which I said was an evidence-based violence reduction strategy. If the city, so like we met with the mayor last week, if she would have said, I'm not going to do GVI, but I'll do another evidence-based violence strategy, we would say, okay, do it. You know, so we will negotiate on that to that extent. Like if you're willing to do something else that's proven, but when we're breaking homicide numbers every year, it doesn't make sense to negotiate to say, oh, just try stuff that's not proven to see if it works, because they've been doing that for several years. And so it's kind of, and we have members who have lost sons, have lost moms, have lost grandparents, and the time has passed to like just try different things to see if they work. And the time is for things that we know work, things that are working in other cities. And so we can negotiate, okay, maybe you won't do this evidence-based strategy, but do an evidence-based strategy, something that's proven, because people are dying.
Listen, your faith journey sounds and feels so familiar, and I just wanted to acknowledge that to me. So grew up over in Eastern Kentucky, and a lot of similarity there. So thank you for that, sharing that with us. I think it was last week and the week before, I can't remember, but you know, the city initiates a series of community conversations called On the Table. And they're held all over the city over during day and night at a number of places, supported by counselors and faith groups and not-for-profits. And I'm just, when you talk about your Nehemiah time, I think about On the Table experiences, those discussions that I participated in, because the city takes those community talks and it helps form priorities, policy priorities for the coming year. And I'm just wondering if B.U.I.L.D participates in those On the Table conversations.
So B.U.I.L.D is I would say B.U.I.L.D is the grassroots leaders that are members of our congregations that are doing all the work. They individually participated in the on-table discussion. B.U.I.L.D didn't officially have like B.U.I.L.D representative.
Sure.
But B.U.I.L.D members definitely participated.
Great. I just feel like that would be such a terrific bridge between those community-wide conversations on problems and policy reform, and of course, what B.U.I.L.D has been doing and is doing too.
Very informative and very helpful. And we certainly appreciate your time here with us today. Thank you.